Okay, so welcome to our seminar on cohesion. This will be really fun. Actually, this is one of the more dry topics, things like articles and tenses and stuff. Really dry, but kind of important for Korean writers because Koreans really have trouble with this kind of stuff. And important for academic writing. But hopefully we'll take a different approach, different than what you're used to in your grammar books and your grammar classes and such, because traditional approaches in your grammar books aren't very helpful. Next week is midterms, and we won't have there's no seminar next week. And also the following week I will be gone on a conference trip, so we'll take a break for 2 weeks, and then we'll come back here in 3 weeks. The next one is refining one's style and expression. That has to do with wording and word choice problems, particularly the kinds that Koreans have trouble with. And then the next one is writing for the teaching career. If you are doing the certificate program, that's strongly recommended. That one will deal with CVs, cover letters, resumes, research statements, grant applications, teaching statements, things like that, writing lesson plans. So if you're doing the certificate, you have to write up and turn in some of those sample writing materials. So that seminar would be highly recommended for you. The last lecture of the semester will be advanced lecture and presentation techniques. And then after that, those of you who are applying for the certificate program will be coming for micro-teaching. You'll say prepare a 10-minute mini lecture, 10 to 12-minute mini lecture, and you'll come with a couple of other fellow graduate students, and you'll come and actually teach a mini lecture to me, in a small audience. It could be part of a real lecture that you might give. It could be a conference presentation. It could be a summary of a lecture that you might give if you were a professor or a 강사 or a teacher somewhere someday at a college level. So anyway, let's go ahead and get started with cohesion. So cohesion kind of overlaps with coherence, which we talked about last week. Coherence is more about the logical flow of ideas and the logical flow of sentences and phrases and clauses. Cohesion is more about the logical flow of words, wording. So when you see a word or a noun phrase, does the reader know easily identify what it is, how it connects with other words? Particularly, for example, in this first section, when you use a particular noun or if you use a pronoun, is it clear enough so that the reader really knows what you're talking about? And there are some style differences according to different styles of writing and also from one field to another. So in some fields you might use a lot of keyword repetition, where maybe certain keywords, terms, nomenclature, specialized terms in the field are often repeated again and again. Maybe it's hard to, so this is done somewhat in social science writing. In science and engineering, it's very common to repeat the same keywords over and over when you talk about them, because in science writing, it's very dense. If you used a pronoun like it in science writing, it would often be ambiguous. You would not know what it is referring to because there might be a number of different nouns that have been mentioned in the recent context. And so it's good to be aware of what is done in your field and to use a lot of keyword repetitions where sometimes keywords are repeated or keywords are repeated fairly often. This is done in either more dense kinds of academic writing or number two, sometimes for rhetorical effect. More often, you might use synonyms, especially in humanities writing and in social science, education writing and such. By the way, when I say social science, I mean as things are internationally recognized as social sciences. For some reason, universities in Korea organize departments a little strangely, and they put things in liberal arts or humanities that really belong in social sciences. So things like psychology, linguistics, sociology, archaeology, a lot of those things, those are social sciences, not really humanities. So Sometimes synonyms are used when possible. I think perhaps this is more common in humanities, especially in, say, writing about literature, where as a writer, as a scholar, the beauty and elegance of your writing is important, and so people in those fields, people who do literature, don't like to repeat the same words. Even in scholarly writings about literature, they don't like to repeat the same nouns. So they try to use synonyms as much as possible. Whereas in science, it's really hard to find synonyms for a lot of technical words that you're using. In other STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, math, what we call STEM. I mean, how do you find a synonym for factor analysis, or a synonym for nanotube, or carbon-14? No, you can't. What instead you might do is sometimes you might use paraphrases. So in number 2, for example, this new engine, blah, 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 and then in the next sentence you might refer to it as apparatus. It's not exactly a synonym, but it's kind of a paraphrase. Whether heard migrated and traveled and trek, those are sort of synonyms. Other times you might use paraphrases instead of, say, occasionally, instead of repeating, chi-square analysis, you might say this statistical technique or the statistical model or something like that. Occasionally, you might use paraphrases. They're not exact synonyms, but they help avoid repetition. So maybe read a few papers in your field and look at how maybe noun phrases are repeated, especially key words, technical terms. Because sometimes it doesn't sound good when you keep repeating the same words over and over. Chi-square analysis, chi-square analysis, chi-square analysis, or ANOVA, ANOVA, ANOVA. It sounds kind of boring, and in some fields they might use paraphrases like this technique, this method, this procedure. That's kind of a paraphrase. Like I said, sometimes pronouns. Now I'd like to, in section 3 on pronouns, I'd like to point out a minor thing that Korean writers have trouble with. Because sometimes Koreans tend to avoid using this or that, and they use it in certain cases. So here at the bottom of page 3, here's an example. Many universities now focus on their status in the international rankings and may thus turn to short-term means of boosting their rankings, such as pushing for more courses taught in English to the detriment of meaningful teaching and learning. So in the next sentence, a Korean writer, I notice, will often say it, like it ultimately does not serve the students or faculty. In this case, it would be unclear, because it would refer to a specific thing, something specific that had been mentioned before. But in this case, we're not referring to just one thing, but maybe a whole idea, the whole idea of the previous sentence. And so for that, the word this is better, maybe sometimes that. To distance yourself from it. So in this case, this ultimately does not serve, because you're talking about this situation, this circumstance. And in fact, you could also write this situation, this circumstance ultimately does not serve the students, or this phenomenon, this practice. You can find some other kind of paraphrase word, or just use this. So this can refer back to a whole idea, or the idea of a preceding sentence. In that case, it's better to use this, or paraphrase like this situation. Likewise, in number 2, General Astronomy Conference voted to demote Pluto to planetoid from its previous status as a regular planet. As many general astronomers argued for a strongly particular criterion for defining a planet that would exclude Pluto. This, okay, so in this case, it would really not work because you're referring to a whole idea or a whole event. Not just one thing. If you see it, you might think it refers to Pluto, but it's not Pluto. You're referring to, this conclusion, this decision, this criterion, maybe this debate, etc. So you could either use this conclusion, or paraphrase, or just say this. This, however, is rejected by, in other words, this conclusion. And it's interesting to read science news and see, or watch videos on YouTube and see scientists debating whether Pluto is a planet, what used to be the 9th planet of our solar system. And number 3, how each feature factors individually has been examined, but few studies have examined the combined effect. This lack of research, you could maybe say this, or this lack of research provides the basis for the current study. So that's a little pronoun problem that I noticed that ESL students have, for example. And I think words like pronouns and this, which probably functions differently in Korean, and I'm not sure really, I don't know Korean well enough. This, by the way, we call this a demonstrative pronoun. This, that, these, those are demonstratives. I don't know if you can see this. This is a bad marker. Can you read that back there? Okay, demonstrative. Whereas he, she, it are personal pronouns. So you have demonstrative pronouns, you have personal pronouns like he, she, it, they. Demonstratives like this, that, these, those. Then we also have indefinites, and I might have mentioned these before. Oh, this is better. We also have indefinite pronouns. So indefinite pronouns are not commonly used in academic writing. Indefinite pronouns might be more convenient, though, for speaking when you're lecturing or talking. Indefinite pronouns are things like someone, everyone, anyone, something, whoever. No, sorry, not whoever, but everyone, everything, everywhere. Words like that are indefinite pronouns. So not common, not so precise for academic expression in academic writing. But when you're speaking, sometimes you can't think of the right word to say. It's helpful to say, oh, someone, something. We might come back to this next time. So those are types of pronouns in English. Another slight problem for Koreans and other Asians, Chinese, Japanese, etc., is English relative clauses, because they're very different, of course, from Korean. In Korean, you put them before the noun, and they're basically the same as a participle phrase. So Korean relative clauses are basically an extended participle phrase. And as far as I can tell, you don't really distinguish between identifying and non-identifying relative clauses. So, how about this? I visited, let me take an example, it's not in here. I'm just making this up, I don't really have a sister, but so normal relative clause, who lives in Chicago? What happens if you put a comma? What does that change? I visited my sister who lives in Chicago, or I visited my sister who lives in Chicago. So the comma, of course I read with a bit more of a pause there. What's the difference between these two sentences? Nobody knows? Any theories? Hypotheses? Who would like to venture a hypothesis? What's the difference in meaning between these two sentences? Oh, there's some missing. Any ideas? Do you have any idea?
Is it follow from order?
Order?
I mean, the first case, my sister lives in Chicago, and I visit my sister.
Mm-hmm.
In the second case,
Mm-hmm.
I visited my sister, and she lives in Chicago.
Okay, you're on the right track. What is the function of a normal relative clause? So a normal relative clause, this is the more common kind of relative clause, what we call an identifying relative clause. This sentence identifies who my sister is. So, of course I don't have a sister, but if I did, I might say a sentence like this. Maybe I have two sisters and you don't know that. Or maybe you don't know anything about my sister at all. And so I'm identifying my sister and who she is. In this case, I visited my sister who lives in Chicago. So in that case, the relative clause identifies which sister, not the sister who lives in Toronto, or whatever. So that's the normal kind of relative clause. And of course, this would be most common in academic writing and in general speaking. But if you put a comma, in speaking, you're going to put more of a pause. I visited my sister who lives in Chicago. A bit more of a pause in speaking, which correlates to the comma in writing. That is adding more information. So in this case, maybe I assume you know about my sister, or maybe I just have one sister, and it's enough for me to say this. And here, this is not identifying her. This is simply adding more information. This is a non-identifying relative clause, or kind of explanatory. It's kind of an explanatory phrase. It would be just like saying, I visited my sister, let's say she's a veterinarian in Chicago. Maybe before I mention, well, my sister is a veterinarian, so I say, I visited my sister, comma, the veterinarian in Chicago. This is an explanatory phrase, simply adding more information. So who with a comma like that, it's just like this one. It's simply an explanatory phrase that's adding extra information. So Koreans sometimes have difficulty with this. In academic writing, like I said, you'll usually be seeing and using regular identifying relative clauses. More often in informal English or in speaking, you might use the non-identifying or explanatory kind of clause. It's more common in spoken English, because in spoken English we make a distinction with a voice pause right before there. In Korean, do you have any way of distinguishing these two kinds of relative clauses? You don't know? Never thought about it before? Okay. So those are relative clauses, and those kinds of things are a little tricky. So that means relative clauses normally don't have a comma unless maybe there's some other stuff, some other words between sister and who, or or if it's an explanatory clause. Number 3, descriptive phrases using with. So if you look at page 4, the top of page 3, this is a little minor style problem. It's not really incorrect, but it is kind of more of a Konglish style thing. Oftentimes, an East Asian student will write something like, we identified patients who had mild symptoms of hypertension. That's okay, but it's probably not important to really say who had, indicating that they possessed the disease. And in fact, sometimes that might kind of interrupt the flow, because you're dealing with maybe a lot of technical information and technical concepts, and you want it to flow better over all the technical stuff. In this case, maybe you're basically explaining the experimental procedure of your medical study. So in that case, you don't really need that. It would actually flow a little bit better to say in English, we identified patients with mild symptoms. So with instead of having or have. So sometimes Koreans will use the verb, have or having, or who had symptoms. When the with would be better, it would flow better. Number 2, East Asian students often use relative clauses that have as the main verb. It would be better to say relative clauses with have as the main verb. Kind of a little irony here, because clauses that have the verb have. In this case, this have, when you're using have like that as a main verb, for a description, it's a bit unnecessary. And maybe you're thinking of maybe 있다 in Korean, because maybe in Korean you might phrase this with 있다, perhaps. But in this case, in English, for descriptions, it's often not necessary, and you could simply get rid of that and say with for description, for descriptive phrases, unless you really want to emphasize the possession of or existence with the verb have. Likewise, 3, we identified students who had an intrinsic interest in language learning, students with an intrinsic interest. Sounds better. Or maybe another verb, who showed or exhibiting. Okay, so this is some little dull grammatical details. Any questions? Okay, now for the really hard stuff, definite and indefinite articles. This is difficult for Koreans, Japanese, Chinese, Russians, anybody from a language that doesn't have articles. If you are lucky enough to have been in an English-speaking country as a kid, you have an advantage because you had natural exposure and perhaps learned some of this naturally as a kid. Or if you spent time as a kid in another European language that has articles, like maybe if as a kid you grew up learning German or Spanish or French, those languages have articles which generally work like in English. But Korean and other languages have no articles. Another problem is when you maybe learned the grammar of articles, maybe from grammar books or from your English classes, did those explanations help you? The explanations about the and a in your grammar books or in your English classes, did they help you? No, they were probably useless, right? They're pretty useless, especially traditional grammar books or traditional English teachers who just try to teach you a bunch of rules. It doesn't work. Your very traditional kinds of English teachers who just teach you a bunch of rules. In education and linguistics, we call it prescriptive. In other words, like I'm some person who knows everything and I prescribe or I tell you what to do. These are rules that tell you what to do. These are the do's and don'ts of English grammar. That's the wrong way to view grammar. That's probably how you think of grammar. That's how you were taught, but it's wrong. It's completely wrong. It's completely at odds with how linguists understand grammar. Linguists take a descriptive approach. We simply describe how language is used. We look at examples of language used in conversation or in texts. We analyze how native speakers use them, including formal and informal and dialects and such. And we simply just try to describe how these things are used. And that works a lot better because we're not dictating, we're not being grammar Nazis. The prescriptive teachers, those are your grammar Nazis. It doesn't work. And they often teach you wrong things, by the way. Linguists try to describe what's going on in the language, how native speakers use the language. We try to figure out, discern, and describe the principles or patterns of language. And so grammar is not a bunch of do's and don'ts. It's a set of principles or patterns that have meaning. And sometimes the meanings are abstract. And A and the are particularly abstract kinds of things. They convey really abstract kinds of meanings. Tenses, have meanings. The present simple has a certain meaning. The present progressive, like I am going, that has a certain meaning. The perfect tense, I have gone, it has a certain meaning. It's not just a grammar rule, it's a pattern that has meaning. So likewise, A and the are not a bunch of dumb rules in a grammar book. They have meanings, but they're abstract meanings. And linguists don't fully understand them, to be honest. So that's one problem. Your education was very prescriptive, and they tried to teach you rules that didn't work. These were rules written by people who didn't really know linguistics very well. And secondly, linguists don't fully understand how articles work. Linguists are still working on it. but maybe today I can give you maybe some newer linguistic insights that are different from what you've been taught. A and the are they are basically patterns of meanings that are kind of abstract. And a little secret, not all native speakers agree, because on a particular word in a particular context, whether you should put a or the, it varies a little bit. It's a little secret that hasn't really been talked about, I think. So if you have a given article or text or passage, two different native speakers for certain nouns might have different ideas about whether you should use a or the or no article, because a and the, they convey very sometimes abstract nuances, kind of very minor subtle differences in meaning. So it will depend on a particular speaker and the kind of nuance that they want to convey. There are times when it might be possible to use a or the or no article. So it's not so prescriptive teaching has led you to believe that it's always something is always right or wrong. There's only one right way to do it. With articles, there are sometimes different possibilities. Sometimes a noun could take a or the or no article, depending on the nuance that the writer wants to express. So sometimes it's not one or the other. Sometimes there are different possibilities. And sometimes if two native speakers correct the same, if two different native speakers proofread the same article, they might correct it differently when it comes to articles, because they have different feelings about the nuance, or they have different ideas about the information flow and what they know and what they would want to convey. Articles are tricky, but what I have here on page 3 are some sample texts by Korean students, which I've corrected. I've corrected by striking out some things, and where maybe there was no article, I did that to indicate that an article should be there. So when you see this, that means the writer had no article, but I put that in to indicate that an article probably should be there. So when you see that or that, this is kind of my way of indicating on the typewriter of saying an article should be inserted. Some other things that kind of underlined in order to flag them. So for example, there is a case here on, I think example number 2, where a person had it, and I struck it out and I indicated, put the word this in there. So what I've got in square brackets are things to be inserted. So rather than for me to talk for a minute, I'm going to rest my voice. I'm going to make you look at this. Maybe you don't need to look at all of this. Maybe 1, 2, and maybe some of the examples here in number 3. Try to understand the mistake that the Korean writer make and why I maybe suggested putting in an article in certain places or deleting articles. So take a look at this for a minute and then discuss with a partner, discuss with somebody next to you why you think maybe I marked some articles as incorrect, or why I suggested putting in an article, and why the writer, so if you see this for example, why did the writer leave out the? And why do I prefer putting in the there? Why would the be better? Or why would a be better there? Why did the writer leave it out? And why do I want it in there? Okay, so take a couple minutes, read these examples, and then discuss with a neighbor. So you should be talking with a neighbor, discussing these corrections that I've made. Okay, so if it's underlined, I was simply kind of flagging it as problematic. So I'm simply indicating a possible problem by underlining something. So I'll actually mention that later on. Okay, do you need more time? Okay. So number one, the purpose of the study and so on. So what do you think about the corrections that I made or the mistakes that the writer made? In the first line, the writer left out A, and I put in A, like A deeper understanding. So why did the writer leave out A there? Or why should it be A? Or why is A the best choice here? Does understanding take an article? Not usually, but in this case it does. Why? Okay, that's perhaps part of it, but I think there's a more important reason. What about, okay, let's take a noun like support. Let me have a word like support here. Maybe I should use red. Maybe the red marker is good. Well, let's take a noun like support. Do you usually say a support or the support? The support? Okay, probably not usually. I need support. Okay. But what if I'm the president of a company and I say to you all, I need the support of all of my employees? There I would say the. I need the support of all my employees. So what changes it? What changes it? I need support, or I need the support of all my employees.
The reference is concrete.
Mm-hmm.
And all employees.
Okay, so the following phrase, of all my employees, the support of all my employees, that phrase makes it more specific. Support is usually an abstract noun. It's usually abstract in meaning. But abstract nouns often have no article. Support, environmentalism, philosophy, etc. But there are certain ways you can make it more specific. So, for example, you're talking about a specific kind or type. So, something that is a bit less abstract and more specific is maybe a specific type. A specific type, kind, or instance, particular instance of support. And we'll see this later. So support is usually over here, where it doesn't take any article, and we can kind of use a symbol, the null symbol, meaning no article. Whereas more concrete nouns tend to take V and A over here. Well, support can kind of move over here to something that's more specific. The support of all my employees. Same thing here. A deeper understanding of their students. So sometimes a prepositional phrase can make a word more specific. The prepositional phrase indicates you're talking about not just general abstract support, but here you're talking about a specific instance or a specific type of support. So, that's the bad one. That kind of prepositional phrase is called a post-modifier. It's a modifying expression that comes after a noun. So adjectives are modifiers that come before nouns in English, but a post-modifier is an expression that modifies a noun and comes after the noun. For example, a prepositional phrase, the support of all my employees, or a deeper understanding of their students. The next line, the student left out the before interviews, and interviews should be specific. It should have the because. Well, interview, I'm going for an interview. We're doing interview. Interview refers to kind of a specific activity, or a specific event. So in this case, specific interviews are implied. They interviewed them separately, so meaning it's specific. It would be known in the context. So also things that are in specific instances, specific events, and such. So Interview is usually this kind of noun. We say the interview, a interview. The next line, the observational data. And this is kind of tricky. It's not incorrect, I guess, to say the observational data, but here it just sounds, it's here you're talking, and so, like I said, we don't fully understand articles, and this is one that I have trouble explaining. Yes, of classroom behavior is a post modifier, but still you're talking about general classroom behavior, not specific classroom behavior. And data is kind of a general abstract noun too. So maybe it's not really incorrect to say the here, but I just think it's better to leave it out, and so I crossed it out. And so, like I said, linguists don't fully understand articles, and this is an example where it feels strange. Yes, I have a cute self-tone. That's actually important, probably, but anyway. It just sounds strange to say the observational data, because at this point, this is the first time they've talked about data, this data set. When the writer returns to this point later, yeah, you could say the observational data. And the next one, a 1-week trial. Trial here is a specific event. You're talking about a specific event. So this kind of relates to what makes a noun specific, where you would use a or the. What makes a noun more general or abstract so that you have no article? Well, this is kind of a question we'll come back to in a minute. How about number 2, cultural diversity? Would you put the on cultural diversity? You're not talking about any one specific type or form of cultural diversity. You're just talking about cultural diversity as an abstract noun, abstract general meaning. So the meaning is more general. So it's better to have no article on there. And the next line, the same is true for collectivism. Collectivism, no article. We're going to a U.S. school. So school should have an article, a school, or the school. In this case, because we're not talking about any specific ones. The U.S. environment. Environment usually is something specific. And so on. Number 3, I think the 4th line, the writer put these cities, the problem in these cities, which really doesn't make sense here the first time the writer is mentioning cities, because cities is a specific thing. You probably know countable noun. A countable noun, you can count like 1 city, 2 cities, and you probably know if it's a countable noun, it should have an article of some kind. And you can take a noun like that and simply use it in the plural, like cities, which gives it kind of a general meaning. So if you say these cities, it implies or means specific cities. Like I'm talking about Los Angeles, New York City, Chicago. But in this context, this is kind of an introduction to a paper about urban planning. So it doesn't really make sense to imply any specific cities. So city is usually a concrete noun. But a concrete noun like that, you use it in the plural with no article, like cities, problems in cities. That gives it a more abstract meaning, meaning cities in general, any kind of city, all cities, or any kind of city. So nouns can actually move back and forth between these categories. Nouns, there are some nouns that like to take articles, but you use them in the plural with no article, like cities, becomes more general or abstract in meaning. Take support and put the on it, it takes on a different meaning. This is what I mean by the nuances of nouns with articles. You can change the meaning by, so sometimes you have a choice of whether to use a or the, or no article, or to put it in the plural. And that changes the meaning. Let me just mention a few more of these. Later on, by the way, I underlined human being here in the first paragraph of number 3 because that sounds kind of funny. Human being sounds like a biology description, like you're talking about humans and not aliens, or humans as opposed to gorillas and chimpanzees, which really is not relevant to in urban planning, because I think you obviously know you're dealing with people. You're not building cities for chimpanzees or for Martians or anything. So human being sounds kind of dry, scientific. It's better to say people, maybe persons. And there's some others, like except that the field. It's better to avoid our, we, first person, and say the field, meaning the field of urban planning, and so on. Some of these others are pretty similar, and I think you can guess, but let me break away from this for a moment. Support can take the or a if you put a post modifier on it. There's another kind of support where I can put an article on it, just a support, the support. That means if I'm talking about a bridge support. So usually support in the abstract sense means like, you know, giving somebody some help or some aid, financial support, economic support. But a bridge can be held up by a bridge support, a column. So you can call that a support. So that's a completely different meaning, and that's another tricky thing. A support generally has the more abstract meaning of like aid, help, and such, but you can talk about a bridge support. This column, this thing that holds up a bridge, that's a support. Different meaning altogether. It's more of a concrete meaning. So the question is, what makes things more concrete or more abstract? What about water? Is water usually used with or without an article? Usually without, but can you say a water? Can you say, give me a water? If you're at a restaurant, yes, and you order, meaning a bottle of water, give me a coffee. Okay? Or if you say, give me the water, like that particular amount or container of water or coffee. So that makes it more concrete, more specific. You change the meaning. Okay, how about bungee jumping? Have you ever tried bungee jumping? No, you should try. It's really fun, especially when grad school gets too stressful. Go to Yutong Gongwon, do a bungee jump. It's a great stress release. So I usually speak of bungee jumping. I like bungee jumping. No article, right? No article. Bungee jumping. I love bungee jumping. But I might talk about a particular jump. I had a great jump. I did a jump. I haven't done it this year. I've been too busy, but I need to. It's too late now, I think. I think they shut down at the end of October. But I could say I had a great jump, a jump. Okay. So bungee jumping, no article, more abstract, because you're talking about a type of activity. A type of activity. Whereas if I say a jump, then I'm talking about a particular instance or event. So we have kind of general activity with no article, which is it's more abstract than those. It's not quite as abstract as words like support, because actually words like support really go over here with no article. So your most abstract kind of nouns are maybe words like support, which are kind of abstract in general, with no article. Slightly less abstract are nouns that refer to maybe activities or states, conditions, descriptions. So for example, redness, kind of more abstract. Redness can be a sign of a health problem. So if you say, well, if a person's face is really red, you might say redness okay, if I have redness on my fingers because I've been using red like markers, but if your face is red, you can say redness could be a sign of a health problem. But if I put a post modifier on it, the redness of your face. If I see your face, I say, the redness of your face concerns me. Then I'm putting a post modifier on it, and I'm making it into a specific instance. So not just redness in general as a general state, but a particular instance, the redness of your face, particular instance. So that changes the meaning. So you can change the meanings of nouns by changing the article from a or the. Of course, a or the, whether it's specific or not, that's also tricky. You probably have a general rule that you're taught. If it's the first time that you mention it, you tend to use a, and then afterwards you tend to refer to it as the. That's generally true, but there are also some more complicated cases, which I'll get to in a minute. Concrete nouns. The most concrete nouns are objects, which naturally have a or the. For example, chair. Things that are physical objects. So physical objects, those are your most natural count nouns, countable nouns. Bottle, marker, whiteboard, things that are objects, physical objects. Those are usually the or a, depending on the context. If you want to make them a bit more abstract, like I like chairs, or I like red chairs. No article, plural, makes it a bit more abstract, meaning generic. So becomes more generic. So generic nouns, no articles. Then we have objects and then materials. So object nouns typically have the or a. Next are materials, a bit more abstract. Water. So water usually no article, but if you're talking about a particular quantity or particular container or a particular type of water, then it becomes more concrete. Goes over here. I don't have enough dimensions on the two-dimensional whiteboard to really draw this very well, but water over here, kind of more abstract. The water, particular quantity of water, or I might say I like the water that I had from the mountain stream. If you go like hiking in the mountains around here, there are natural springs. So I like the water that I had from the mountain streams, the Yaksu springs, right in the mountains here. So a particular type. So a particular type makes it more specific. So again, you can change the meaning of nouns. So back to A and the, old or new information. The difference between A and the, that's trickier. That's kind of harder to explain. But like I said, you were probably taught first time you mention something, it's usually a, and then after that you say the. Not always true though, not always true. I will, if I'm talking about any kind of room or building, or if it's implied, then if I mention the parts of the room, I'm going to simply say the wall. So I don't need to first identify it by saying a wall. I just point to it and say the wall, the floor, the ceiling. That's because in any context that involves a room or building, you know in your knowledge of the world that all rooms have walls and floors, all buildings have walls and floors and ceilings. And I don't need to mention that. So I can just say the wall. So that's kind of a different pattern that's going on, the wall. Another thing would be the sun. Okay, I don't have to identify it by saying a sun. That would be kind of strange, right? If I said a sun, a moon, you might think, what planet are you from? Because actually on a different planet, well, things might be different. Here, so this involves kind of common knowledge, assumption, things that we assume from the context. There is only one sun and one moon here. But You could live on a planet that has 2 moons, like Mars. You know Mars has 2 moons. Do you know the names? The names of the moons of Mars? Phobos and Deimos. You should know this. This is basic geography. Okay, what if you get lost? Come on. So on Mars, if I say, oh, the moon looks pretty tonight, you would say, which one? I need to identify it. I can't just say the moon. I need to say Phobos or Deimos or something. Or the moon over there. So that may not work. Do you know the closest star to us? Our closest star? The closest star to us, it's about 4.5 light years away, Alpha Centauri. Do you know this? It's our nearest star. It's actually not one star, it's actually a binary star. It's actually 2 stars. It's binary. It's 2 stars that orbit each other. So if there were a planet there, we don't know, but if there were a planet there, and you look into it, and if you're there, living on that planet, and you look up in the sky, you can't say the sun. There might be 2 suns in the sky, because you would have 2 suns. So, but on Earth, it's easy. We just say the sun, the moon. You don't say a sun, unless we're talking about some other context, like maybe other planets, where does this planet have a sun or something like that. Some other examples. Sometimes in literature and in description, sometimes you do a scene shift, and the writer simply starts using the. Like the writer is talking about something else and then changes the scene and says, blah, 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 the mountain, blah, blah, blah. Well, the mountain hasn't been mentioned before, but it makes it more vivid, more lifelike, more descriptive if the writer does that. So this is also a literary technique that writers do. The mountains were glistening in the sunlight. Well, the mountains were not mentioned before, but writers sometimes do that because you can kind of guess what mountains are being talked about. So situations where the reader can guess, make a good guess or an intelligent guess, writers will say the instead of a. That's kind of not an exception, but just a different meaning pattern that's going on with articles. Here's another one. For example, there's a pop song from the 1960s. You're probably too young to remember this. It says, in the jungle, the mighty lion sleeps tonight. So it's saying the jungle, the lion. But this is the beginning of a pop song. You don't know what jungle, you don't know what lion. The writer of the song has not identified. It's not like, oh, that lion named Simba, he's a friend of mine, he lives down the hall or something. No, the writer simply introduces it with the. And so this is sometimes done sometimes in descriptive context, narrative context, sometimes also in academic writing. When you're using maybe, so you don't have a specific lion in mind, but you're kind of picking one as a hypothetical example. What linguists would call, or people in linguistics and other fields call an exemplar. It's an example, a hypothetical or typical lion. You've kind of randomly picked some hypothetical lion and you're using him as an example. The lion sleeps tonight. So it's kind of an exemplar. A typical or hypothetical example, one that represents or is typical of all lions. And so sometimes you see this sometimes in academic writing. The cheetah, also in like documentaries and narrative context, the cheetah can accelerate very quickly. Which cheetah? Well, just any cheetah, but you say the cheetah to kind of make it more vivid, sounds more vivid and descriptive. Then there are cases where we leave out articles where you would expect them. We talk about, I go to school by bus, by train, and we leave out the, because you don't mean a particular train, you just mean train as a general source of transportation. So sometimes you leave out articles to make the noun more general. So you talk about, say, with the prepositional phrase, for example, you're talking about a general means of transportation. The satellite is in orbit, not in orbit, but just in orbit as a general place or location. In English, we say, I'm going to the store. Which store? Well, just some typical store that I go to. I don't specify which one. But we also say, I'm going to school. I'm going to church. Which school? Well, it's not specified. Just school is a general kind of location. So in that case, it's a kind of location. The focus is on a kind of place, a kind of location, or a kind of means of transport, like by bus. So these are all the nuances and such of articles, which are not terribly understood. But on the website, I've got a 4-page summary of these, and then I've got a longer detailed description that's about 13 pages that includes some of these scene shifts and other specialized uses of articles, that people do. Hope that helps you. A couple of final things. I wanted to talk briefly about verb tenses. So you can read about articles more on your own in these lovely handouts. What about verb tenses in your academic writing? So as you're reading your academic papers, pay attention to the nouns and think about why is the writer using the or a or no article there. Think about them and try to understand the nuance the writer is expressing. Verb tenses. When you read academic papers in your field, what tenses do the writers use? Do they use present tense all the time? Do they sometimes use past tense? Or do they sometimes use perfect tense? Like, I have written. That's perfect tense. Some grammar books call it present perfect. We linguists just call it perfect. Like, I have gone, I have written, I have experimented. Perfect tense. So, papers in your field. What tenses do you use? Do writers use? And when? When do they use present tense? When do they switch to the past tense when they write in your field? When do they use the perfect tense? In your papers, so in your fields, how many of you read papers in published articles, published scholarly papers, research papers that are all present tense? How many of you read papers that include past tense, simple past, for example, past tense verbs? Yes. So when do the writers switch to past tense?
When it is about facts, with experiments.
Okay, so experiments, for example, they're talking about past experiments, past research. So in many fields, they use the past tense for talking about past experiments. But sometimes, at least in social science fields, I notice, they might switch back and forth. When they're talking about past research, in some fields, they might use the present tense. So-and-so proposes that, so-and-so suggests that, even though it was past research. If it's experiments, past studies, then you use past tense because you're talking about something that was done in the past. So why do writers sometimes use present tense, though, when they're talking about, say, so-and-so suggests that, so-and-so observes, claims, notes that? And this might actually vary from one field to another. In some fields or subfields or some journals, they might say so-and-so observes that, or they might say so-and-so observed that. But what is the present tense for? Well, you probably learned it's for habitual action, like I go to school at 9 o'clock every day, something I do habitually, regularly. But present tense is also for facts and descriptions, because facts by nature are something habitual, something that you assume is always true. But facts can extend to general descriptions. So if you notice sports announcers often use the present tense to narrate news. Sometimes newspaper headlines, at least in English, are in the present tense because you're describing it. So-and-so kicks the ball, so-and-so hits the ball, intercepts the ball in sports descriptions. So facts are used for descriptions and like headlines because it sounds more vivid and lifelike. Also for statements about theories. So when you're talking about knowledge, it could be factual knowledge or it could be theoretical knowledge. Even theories, whether proven true or not, are a kind of factual knowledge. So present tense is often used for descriptions and also theoretical knowledge. So you might be talking about what research, a study that somebody did, an experiment that they did, but then you might switch to the present when you're talking about, as a result, this is what we now know. We know that blah, blah, blah because they did an experiment. So sometimes you're switching, in some fields, you're switching between past and present. Present tense when you're talking about the general knowledge, especially in fields where you do theoretical research, philosophy, theoretical linguistics, you're talking about theoretical knowledge or theoretical findings, so-and-so, somebody's theories, someone's proposals in a theoretical field or theoretical domain. So when you're describing maybe theories, current theories, theoretical knowledge, as well as factual knowledge, what we have learned, use the present. And again, you might switch back and forth. The past tense for so-and-so did this experiment and discovered that, and then we know that as a result. We know that this is what learners do when they read text. So switching to present tense, we know this is what they do. So he can switch. So in some fields, you probably see writers switch back and forth between the present and the past, especially in the literature review section. When they're talking about past research, they could use present tense for describing current theoretical knowledge, current factual knowledge as a result of the research, and the past tense for describing what the researchers did or when they did something. And also in the discussion section, maybe after an experiment in the discussion section, you're kind of explaining your results. This is what we found. And then you talk about the implications in terms of our factual knowledge or theoretical knowledge, and also refer to other sources in terms of what they did and what they found that goes along with what you are claiming and what you have found. So the present tense is used for this kind of stuff. Past tense is for past research. Perfect tense. When to use the perfect tense?
When addressing other ideas,
Sometimes.
papers.
So you might use it when you're talking about somebody else's ideas, but not just talking about some of the, because oftentimes you might use the past tense for that, like simple past, so-and-so did an experiment. But sometimes you might use the perfect tense, so-and-so has found that, blah, blah, blah. And when you say the perfect tense has found, it has an implication for the present. Because the core idea of the perfect tense, the core idea is recency. Something that was done recently. But recency is relative. So kind of a non-academic example, you might say, I broke up with my boyfriend, or I have broken up with my boyfriend. What's the difference? It's a kind of a non-academic example. If you say, I broke up with my boyfriend, that means you're over it. You're fine now. You don't care about him anymore. But if you say, I have broken up with my boyfriend or girlfriend, that means it still affects me now. Maybe you're still hurting, you're still depressed, whatever. So so it's relatively recent. Because of that, it has a current implication or current effect, a current relevance. So recency implies relevance. It's somehow relevant or important to the present. It doesn't matter if the breakup with your boyfriend or girlfriend was a week ago or 6 weeks ago. You could say either simple past, I broke up, or I have broken up, either way. So sometimes you might talk about, say, so-and-so has found that, implying, and thus I'm doing my experiment because of that. because I want to follow up on what so-and-so has found, or so-and-so has reported that, but I don't believe him, so I'm going to do something different and disprove what they said. So you're maybe connecting it with your research, with maybe providing a rationale for what you're going to do, or other ways in which you're maybe citing what somebody else did, and you're building on it in your research, in your lit review, or in the discussion section of your paper. You're kind of implying that it's somehow relevant to the present, somehow, in terms of what you are doing. You're making a connection between what they reported and what you're doing now. And those are cases where you use the perfect tense. So the perfect tense is really tricky, and it's not been taught very well, I think, to you all in your language classes. One final thing that has to do with cohesion, and that's parallel structures. And just a few examples. When you have like clauses, complex sentences with multiple clauses, you want those clauses or phrases to be grammatically consistent with each other. So in the first example, the teacher said he was a poor student because he waited until the last minute to study for the exam, so he got a verb. Completed, a verb, his lab problems in a careless manner, and his motivation was low. We've got a noun phrase. His motivation was low. So that's kind of a clash. They're not consistent. So you want to reword that so they're all maybe consistent. Maybe that one's a verb phrase. So he lacked motivation, so that they're all consistently verb phrases. The next one, the sales staff expected he would present his product, it would be time for him, and he would be asked by prospective buyers. Well, you've thrown in a passive verb at the end, active, passive, that sounds funny. You could say that prospective buyers would ask him questions. So you can make complex sentences like these more consistent by changing maybe a noun to a verb phrase. His motivation was low, he lacked motivation. Or sometimes you can change verbs to nouns by making them gerunds, like waiting until the last minute, completing his lab problems slowly, using gerunds, or prepositions with gerunds. So those are little things you can do to make those kinds of phrases more consistent. Okay, there are more handouts on the website about articles and about other related aspects of cohesion in writing. In a few weeks, we are going to talk about word choice problems, wording, issues of Korean writers in academic writing and popular writing as well. And don't forget to sign up for that, and especially for the 8th one on writing for a teaching career. If you're doing the certificate program, it's not required, but that would be very helpful, for doing CVs, resumes, lesson plans, those kinds of things in the future, teaching statements, research statements, grants, and such. All right, so thanks, and enjoy your weekend.